Cowboy saw an Apache woman washing her clothes by the river and noticed her dress was torn to pieces. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
Harlan Voss rode along the narrow trail that cut through the outskirts of Sagewater Bend as the late afternoon settled into a steady, cooling dimness. His horse moved at a slow, practiced pace, hooves pressing into the dry earth with a faint, rhythmic thud. The land around him was quiet except for the rustle of thin brush and the soft push of river wind against his coat. He had ridden this path hundreds of times over the years, checking his cattle and making sure nothing dragged wolves or bandits onto his property. He preferred a routine that never changed. It kept his thoughts from straying back to the house he once lived in, to a wife and newborn son he buried long before he was ready to stop being a husband or a father. At 38, Harlan moved like a man who had trained himself not to hope for anything. He lived alone in a small cabin 3 miles south of town, spending his days repairing fences, watching his grazing stock, and avoiding conversations that had no purpose. The river trail was part of that routine. It took him past the grazing fields, past the tree line, and back home before the cold settled too deep. Today should have felt the same, but as he guided his horse around a bend near a cluster of cottonwoods, he caught sight of movement down by the water. He slowed immediately. The horse's ears perked up. Harlan straightened in the saddle, shifting his weight to get a clearer view. A woman knelt near the riverbank, her body leaning over a piece of torn deerskin clothing she scrubbed against a flat stone. Her motions were small and shaky, each stroke made with more desperation than strength. The fabric she worked on carried smeared and dry blood, dark in patches that refused to wash away. Her long black hair hung wet down her back, dripping into the shallow water. Her dress clung to her curves, heavy with river water, torn low enough across the chest that he could see bruises along her collarbone and the accidental opening where stitching had ripped during some violent struggle. She held the dress tighter across her chest, as if she feared it might slip further. She looked exhausted, not tired from a day's work, but worn to the edge of collapse. Harlan could see the tremor in her hands and the way her knees sank deeper into the wet sand each time she leaned forward. Her bare feet were scraped and reddened, and small cuts marked her ankles in thin lines. She hadn't noticed him yet. Harlan watched her for a few seconds, trying to understand whether she posed a threat, whether someone might be hiding nearby, whether she needed help or wanted to avoid him entirely. Years alone had made him cautious. He did not approach strangers without purpose. When his horse exhaled sharply, the woman's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto him with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She gripped the torn dress to her chest with both hands, pulling it higher in a reflexive attempt to cover the exposed bruises. Harlan lifted one hand slowly and eased the reins, signaling that he wasn't here to chase her off or drag her anywhere she didn't want to go. He dismounted with deliberate calm, boots settling into the dirt without a heavy sound. He kept enough distance that she wouldn't feel cornered. The woman's breathing turned shallow, her eyes darting between his face, his hands, and the trail behind him. She looked like someone who had run far and no longer had the strength to keep going. Harlan crouched down, unhooked his canteen, and placed it on the ground halfway between them. He didn't push it toward her. He didn't speak. He stepped back and let her decide. She hesitated only a moment before crawling forward and taking the canteen with unsteady fingers. She lifted it carefully and drank in short, controlled sips, as if she wasn't sure how long the water had to last. After swallowing, she breathed out shakily and set the canteen down again. Her voice came out strained. "I escaped," she said. She glanced at her torn dress, eyes tightening with something between pain and shame. "Bad men. They came at night. They hurt many." Her fingers brushed a bloodstain on the fabric. "Some of this is theirs. Some is mine." Harlan felt the familiar tension move through his chest. He didn't react outwardly, but the details hit him clearly. Raiders. Violence. Someone left alive by luck or stubbornness. His mind shifted immediately toward threat assessment. Whether those men were close, how many there were, whether they were tracking her. He scanned the riverbank and the tree line, looking for prints or movement, but saw nothing new. He kept his voice level. "You running alone?" She nodded. "Since dawn." "How far?" he asked. She pointed north with a small motion. "From the ridge. I ran until my legs burned." That distance was several miles. Running barefoot over sharp terrain would have torn her feet, and it had. He studied her carefully. Her injuries, her clothing, her posture, everything pointed to someone who had been through violence and barely escaped with her life. He felt a tight pull in his chest, an unwelcome reminder of the day he buried his family and realized there was no one left to protect. The woman watched him assess her, waiting for judgment. Her jaw tensed. "If you want me gone," she said, "say it." Harlan shook his head once. "I don't want that." She blinked, thrown off by the answer. Her legs wobbled when she tried to stand. The dress slipped in her hands, exposing more of her bruised chest before she caught it. She sucked in a breath, humiliated by how easily the fabric betrayed her. Harlan looked away long enough to give her privacy, then reached out only when she swayed again. "You need help standing," he said. She hesitated, eyes searching his face for intent. His expression stayed steady, unreadable but not threatening. After a moment, she let him steady her by the arm. Her skin felt cold from the river. The tremor in her muscles was clear. She managed to stand upright, though her legs shook. Harlan saw more scrapes down her thigh and the deep bruise along her hip. She pulled the torn dress over herself as tightly as she could. "Got somewhere to go?" he asked. "No." Her voice cracked slightly on the word. "No tribe. No home. No family now." He nodded once. A direct answer deserved a direct response. "You can come to my place," he said. "It's close." She stared at him for several seconds, her breathing uneven, her shoulders rising slowly. She looked like someone caught between the instinct to run and the instinct to collapse. Trust didn't come easily to her, and he didn't expect it to, but he also knew she wouldn't survive another night alone. Finally, she whispered, "I will go." Harlan helped her onto his horse, keeping his touch calm and steady. Her hands gripped the saddle horn as she tried to pull herself up, but when she lifted her arms, the neckline fell again. She caught it quickly, cheeks flushing with distress. He turned his gaze away until she had secured it. Once she was stable, he mounted behind her, leaving enough space not to frighten her while maintaining a grip on the reins. As they rode toward his cabin, her body swayed with exhaustion. She held the torn dress, closed with both hands, her breathing uneven. Harlan watched the path ahead while keeping close enough to steady her if she slipped. The sky dimmed. The wind cooled. The river sounds faded behind them. Harlan didn't know who the men were who attacked her, where they were, or what they wanted. But he knew one thing clearly. Leaving her behind was not an option he could live with. He guided his horse forward, carrying a woman who had nothing left toward a cabin that had felt empty for years. Harlan reached his cabin just as the last daylight slipped behind the ridge, leaving the yard in a dim, cold stillness. The cabin sat low against the land, built from rough timber he had cut himself years earlier, the edges worn and uneven from storms and long seasons of neglect. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line. He always kept the fire smoldering when he left so the place wouldn't freeze before he returned. Tala looked at the building with a tense curiosity, her eyes drifting over the walls, the tools hanging by the shed, and the small corral where two horses lifted their heads, watching the newcomer silently. She sat stiffly on the horse as they stopped, gripping her torn dress with both hands. Her breathing held a quiet strain, as though she feared what waited inside the cabin more than what she had escaped. Harlan dismounted first, walked a few steps to steady the horse, then reached up toward her. She froze, unsure again, and he paused long enough for her to understand she could take her time. Her voice was tight when she spoke. "I can climb down." "All right," he said, stepping back. She slid off the horse slowly, landing unsteadily on her scraped feet. The moment she put weight on them, pain shot up her legs, and she clenched her jaw hard. Harlan noticed the way her knees buckled, so he reached lightly toward her elbow. She didn't pull away this time. She let him steady her while she found her balance again, and he felt how cold her skin had become. The cabin door creaked loudly when he pushed it open. Warmth drifted out from the fire inside, carrying the smell of cooked beans and old wood. Tala looked around with guarded eyes, noting the single bed tucked against the far wall, the small table with one chair, the shelf of supplies she didn't yet trust to touch. The interior was kept clean, not tidy from habit but from necessity. One person living alone tended to put everything back where it belonged because no one else would. Harlan shut the door behind them, keeping his voice low and even. "You can sit." Tala remained near the wall instead, holding the torn dress across her chest with one hand and pressing her back lightly against the logs as though grounding herself. Her eyes lingered on the folded blanket over the chair, the boots near the door, and the half-finished carving on the table. Each detail told her something about the man helping her. He lived simply, he worked with his hands, and he spent most nights alone with nothing but chores to occupy him. Her stomach made a faint sound, and she lowered her gaze in embarrassment. Harlan caught it and crossed the room to the pot hanging above the fire. He ladled warm beans into a tin bowl and placed it gently on the table before stepping away. "Eat what you can," he said. "You need strength." She hesitated again, unsure if she was allowed, then moved slowly to the table and picked up the spoon. Her hand shook once before she steadied herself. The first mouthful made her pause, and she swallowed carefully, as if she hadn't eaten a proper meal since before dawn. Harlan pretended not to notice how fast she ate the next few bites, giving her the dignity of silence. Once she'd eaten enough to ease the worst of her hunger, she rested the spoon and sat very still, waiting for his next words. Harlan kept near the fire, rubbing the dirt from his hands and letting her breathe. After a moment, he spoke. "You've been running long enough to tear your feet like that," he said quietly. "Who was chasing you?" Her jaw tightened. "White men. 3, maybe 4. They came to take things from us." She paused. "They were armed. They didn't care who lived." Harlan listened, absorbing each detail. This answered questions any listener would have wondered. Why she was here, how she escaped, whether the danger was close. Tala's voice wavered only when she added, "They killed my sister. She tried to shield a child." They did not stop. Harlan's breath drew in sharply, the weight of her words settling heavy between them. He didn't speak immediately. He didn't know how to soothe the kind of grief she carried, but he understood its shape. Grief wasn't something that burned hot and loud. It pressed down slow and constant, leaving a person unsure whether to scream or sit still. After a moment, he crouched by a small trunk near the bed, opened it, and pulled out a gray shirt he rarely wore. It was clean, softer than most of his clothes, the closest thing to comfort he owned. He held out to her. "This will cover you," he said. She accepted it slowly, fingers brushing the fabric as though testing if it was truly offered. She didn't change immediately. Instead, she held it close to her chest while keeping her eyes fixed on the floor. She wasn't sure yet how much of her safety depended on him, and that uncertainty made her stand stiffly, the torn dress still clutched around her chest. Harlan stood and turned his back to give her privacy. "You can change while I step outside to check the horses," he said, keeping his tone matter-of-fact so she wouldn't feel pressured. She let out a small, shaky breath. "Thank you." He stepped out into the night air, leaving her alone with the crackling fire. As he checked the horses, tightening a loose strap and making sure no tracks followed them to the yard, he let his thoughts settle. He had not planned to bring someone into his home again. He wasn't sure if he could handle seeing another person hurt under his roof. But leaving her at the river hadn't been an option. He knew that the moment he saw the blood on her dress. Inside the cabin, Tala slipped out of the wet deerskin garment, wincing when the fabric pulled at her bruises. She put on Harlan's shirt, the hem falling almost to her knees, the collar loose enough that she had to gather it closed with one hand. The fabric felt warm, carrying the faint scent of smoke and dry earth. For the first time since dawn, she felt covered enough to breathe without panic. When Harlan returned, she stood slightly away from the fire, the shirt hanging long on her, her bare legs marked by dried mud and small cuts. She watched him with cautious eyes, unsure how a man like him judged someone who arrived half-dressed, wounded, and hunted. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll stay by the fire." Her throat tightened. No man had ever offered her safety without expectation. She studied his face, looking for hidden intentions, but found only a quiet, steady seriousness. As he spread a blanket near the hearth, she asked in a low voice, "Why help me?" He didn't pause his movements. "Because you needed someone." She absorbed his answer, simple and clear, without anything beneath it to fear. She sat on the bed slowly, legs trembling as the day's exhaustion finally caught up to her. The silence between them felt different now. Not tense, but careful, like two people trying to understand how to exist in the same space without causing harm. Before lying down, she asked, "If those men come, will you send me away?" "No," he said, "I won't." She breathed out slowly, lowering herself onto the thin mattress with her hand gripping the shirt's front. She watched him as the fire cast shifting light across his face, revealing the shadows beneath his eyes, the tired lines carved there by years of loneliness and the kind of memories that never faded. For the first time since she fled her camp, she felt the possibility of surviving the night. When the cabin settled into quiet, Harlan kept watch without saying another word, and Tala closed her eyes without fear what she might wake to. The fire had burned down to a steady glow by the time the cabin settled into full night. Outside, the wind pushed lightly against the walls, carrying the distant chirp of crickets and the faint groan of trees shifting in the dark. Harlan sat near the hearth, one knee drawn up, his back resting against the side of the table as he kept his eyes on the room. Tala lay on the bed with her fingers curled into the front of his shirt, her breathing uneven from the exhaustion that had finally overtaken her. Every now and then she twitched lightly, the kind of involuntary movement that came from a mind still trapped in the memory of running. He stayed awake because he didn't trust the quiet. Raiders didn't always give up when one survivor slipped away. They tracked, they waited, they circled areas they thought would yield something valuable. And the more he thought about the distance Tala had run and the number of men she named, the more he realized she hadn't escaped an aimless group. They had purpose. They were looking for something or someone. That single detail had been left unclear, and he knew anyone listening would wonder exactly what those men wanted. He turned that question over in his mind as the fire cracked once. Raiders usually sought supplies, livestock, weapons, or women they believed they could sell. But Tala had said they came without warning and struck fast. He sensed there was more to the story, something she hadn't shared yet. He didn't blame her for